Always central to global growth, the oil industry is in turmoil once more. We talked to Carole Nakhle to explore some of the fundamental developments taking place in the industry today. Carole, welcome to Raw Talks.
Thank you.
Let's consider the cheap oil environment of today. Media focus has mostly been on the negative effects seen for producer countries, but surely consumers worldwide, then they benefit. Which of the two has most effect on the global economy?
I would say neither, because if you look at the importance of the oil in today's global economy, it's much lower than it was in the 1970s, for instance. So because of the improvement of efficiency, we are using less oil to produce the same unit of GDP, or gross domestic product. And as such, we're not really seeing the impact of low oil prices. And I would say low, not cheap, because I don't think $50 a barrel is really cheap. When you're talking about 10 or 9, then this is where we're talking about cheap oil. But when we look at the impact of the decline in the oil price from 110 before summer 2014 to below that, we can see that the impact on the global economy has been very limited. And this is because of the efficiency gains that we have achieved over the last 20, 30 years, actually 40 years from the 1970s. Now, in terms of oil producers, and I would say net oil exporters and consumers, here I would be careful not to put all oil producers in the same basket, because you have those who have diversified economies and those who are more dependent on the oil revenues than others. So the more you are dependent on oil revenues, the more you are subject to or exposed to the changes in the oil price. And that's what we're seeing with many developing countries, from Nigeria to Angola to the Middle East, where we can see those governments running massive budget deficits and are having economic problems. But I always try to look at the positive side in every negative story. And if you look at the low periods of oil prices, this is a perfect period to encourage governments to implement economic reforms. For consumers, in general, it's supposed to be good news, because you say you're paying less, but this depends on whether you are fully exposed to the changes in the oil price. So in the US, this may be true, but here in Europe, especially here where we're sitting now, you have taxes on gasoline, for instance, high taxes. So they dampen the effect of the changes in the oil price on the consumption. And the negative side of having low oil prices in today's debate is that it reduces the incentive to move to alternative sources of energy, which become less competitive with cheap oil.
When people think of oil producers, they evoke these Western oil companies like BP, Shell, Exxon, etc. But in fact, they represent just a tiny fraction of world production. What does the global oil industry really look like?
The global industry is much bigger than the Western oil companies. So if you look at the whole supply chain, from upstream exploration and production to midstream and downstream distribution of the oil products, you are talking about thousands of actors involved in this process. But if I look only at upstream in terms of ownership of proven oil reserves in the world, actually it's not the oil majors, the Western big oil companies, the Shells of this world or the Exxons of this world, who are the dominant player. They used to be in the 1960s and 1970s, but today it is the national oil companies who are the dominant players. However, we tend to think primarily of the Western major oil companies whenever we think about the oil industry or producers, for the plain fact that they are international oil companies. They have activities in more than one country all around the globe. They have been around from the beginning of the oil industry more than a century ago. They publish their financial accounts, so we know how much profits they are making because they are owned by international shareholders. So they are more visible to the average reader than the national oil companies, who are more opaque and less transparent than the international oil companies.
But what we see today is that what is said to be the largest oil company, that's the Saudi Aramco, they are actually considering going public. Why is that?
Well, that would be the biggest event for me in the oil industry to watch for. There are different drivers behind it, but it was mainly as part of the Saudi Arabia government to diversify away from oil, as part of their flagship economic reform agenda, the Vision 2030. And one way to encourage the private sector or investment in the country is through privatizing a share of Saudi Aramco. But mind you, we're talking about really a very small share of Saudi Aramco. Now, from my side, what I always ask is that why the Saudis are going down that route instead of simply opening their upstream oil sector to the international oil industry, because they are still one of the very few countries in the world that remain close to upstream oil and gas investments by private companies. So until now, I haven't come across a convincing answer. So why do you go down the route of IPO instead of opening the sector to private investment?
Let's move into the area of investment. You have stressed that lower oil price lead government to compete for investment. But what is it investors are looking for?
Like any investors around the world, irrespective of the industry, investors look for justified return for a certain risk, for a certain level of risk. And the higher the risk, the higher the returns. In the oil industry, how do you calculate the returns? You look at potential production. So for that, you need to look at how much you have in the ground, the size of the reserves. You look at the cost of production, you look at the oil price because they will determine your profit. You also look at the fiscal terms, which are perhaps the only tool within government control affecting directly the return on investors. And they also incorporate the risk, whether political risk, commercial risk, or geological risk, all these are incorporated. But investors will not look at one factor over the other. All these together should provide a sensible return for a certain level of risk. So even if we have two countries with the same oil field, oil projects, exactly the same geology, reserves, and production cost. But in one country you have political instability, so you have wars and unrest, and in the other you don't have that political instability, then the value of the project where you have stability is higher than the one where you don't have that stability. So this is what investors will look for. They will see how each of these factors will balance out in terms of rewards versus risk.
How important is fiscal predictability?
Fiscal predictability is very important because when you talk about oil and gas project, you're talking about the next 30, 40 years. So it's not only fiscal predictability, but you have other like oil price, you have cost issues. So there is lots of uncertainty when you're looking at the future. But because the fiscal terms are within government control, then governments can, at least by providing fiscal stability, they can minimize one risk component. Of course, it's something that investors would like to have, but we have to be realistic. If you set the fiscal terms at the beginning of an oil province life, so before you make discoveries, you should expect those terms to be revised when there are massive discoveries or when the production reaches a plateau or starts to decline. So while it's more of a wishful thinking, and we should promote fiscal stability, but whether it can be guaranteed over that period of time, it's a bit too good to be true, to be secured.
We were talking about developing oil fields and that it can take decades and that project value is based on the long-term prices and not the spot prices. But investors, they seem to be making decisions with today's newspaper in hand. Why is that?
It's slightly more difficult more complicated than holding the newspaper in hand. But it's a very simple economic concept. Today's prices, they shape future expectations. So that is really a very simple equation where whatever the oil price is today is going to shape your future expectations. So if you're starting from low oil price, then your expectations in the future are not going to be that high. Whereas if you start from a high price as today, then your expectations about future prices are going to be higher, which means you're going to have more money to spend, and then you can be bolder in your investment decisions. So you can go for more challenging projects, for costlier projects. And this is why we are really keen on understanding today's prices and where they are going.
But why are investors so bad at investing counter-cyclically?
Actually, investors should avoid tracing or chasing the oil price, and some companies do. I think it's quite known that, for example, ExxonMobil is one of the companies that go beyond, that does not really base its investment decision on the oil price cycle. But for others, they tend to succumb, if you want, to shareholders' pressure and to peers' pressure. So that's where you have to take that into consideration if you were the CEO of another major oil company.
Let's move into the current supply issues. OPEC used to keep prices up by cutting production. Doing that today, they risk losing market shares to non-OPEC producers such as the US, Russia, Brazil, etc. So they keep pumping, and the market is flooded with oil. Is it a race to the bottom we see?
Well, I tell you, with OPEC it's interesting because traditionally, and when I look at OPEC, I look mainly at Saudi Arabia because they are the one with the largest spare capacity. And when you have the spare capacity, then you act like the central bank. So you become the swing producer, adjusting your production level to meet certain market realities. So if the prices are going down, you don't want them to go too low. So what you end up doing, you cut your production to put upward pressure on prices. But by the same token, if prices are too high, you don't want them to go further up because otherwise you encourage the development of alternatives and you lose your customers. So you tend to increase your production to kind of balance the market. That was true up until summer 2014. But then when we had the crash in the oil price from 110 or 100 to really $30 a barrel, OPEC and the rest of the world realized there was a fundamental change in the oil market. That is the advent of shale oil production. And shale oil, unlike conventional oil production, it is much faster in terms of responding to oil prices. So traditionally, with conventional oil, you would take the investment decision today and you would expect oil production to start maybe 7 to 10 years down the line. With shale, it's a question of months, maybe 18 months. So there is this flexibility. So for 2 years, between almost summer 2014 and then December 2016, OPEC did not do anything. They let the market behave on its own. But where were the oil prices going? They were going down. Until December 16, it was not just OPEC. OPEC managed to have the biggest non-OPEC oil producers alliance in the history of the oil industry. And they agreed also to cut production, not to increase prices to where they used to be before summer 2014, but to put a floor to the oil price. And actually that's what happened. Oil prices were not going down, they went up again. But whatever they cut and announced in December 2016, it had to be extended. And today what we're seeing, we see the oil price hovering around 50. And if OPEC wants to see a bigger price, they will have to cut more. But as you said, they are going to lose market share. So you have here the dilemma: low oil price and bigger market share, or high oil price and smaller market share. So this is what OPEC has to decide.
So who will blink first, Saudi Arabia or the Western producers?
I have the feeling that it is Saudi Arabia who will, if OPEC decides to cut further, I think Saudi Arabia is going to take the lead because they would like to see the oil price going above 50, actually in the region of 60. And to be honest, they can afford it. At the end, they are the lowest cost producer. So it will be a very interesting time ahead for OPEC and the global oil industry.
Now you mentioned shale oil and the shift that it meant to the global oil industry by increasing elasticity of supply, but why hasn't this taken off outside of the US?
We go back to the concept of investment, the core relationship between investments and production. And if you look at the US in general, they are very investor friendly, especially we're talking about the oil investor. So this is where the oil industry from the beginning, more than a century ago, took off. And it's very well developed. It's a very competitive industry. You have well-developed infrastructure. You have all sorts of suppliers. You have government policies which are pro-investment. And you have a very important thing, which is the private ownership of the mineral in the ground, which is one of the few, actually, apart from few places in Canada, the only place in the world where you do have this private ownership of the mineral, and you also have less dense populated areas. So when you have all these components together and you look on the global map, you see that even though the US is not sitting on the biggest shale oil or shale gas reserves, but you understand why they led the revolution, and that revolution has been very slow in terms of being replicated elsewhere, because you don't have all these boxes, you're not taking all these boxes together. That said, I can see China following on the US footsteps, but here we also have some uncertainties because China is sitting on massive shale oil and gas reserves.
What needs to happen in China for those reserves to develop?
Encourage private investment.
Can hydrocarbons coexist with climate change concerns?
They already do. So the transition to a cleaner, greener future is not going to happen overnight. I know we would like to see that, but we have to be realistic because so many products come from oil, not only the transport sector, but many products in this room come actually from oil. So our modern societies are built on being more of an oil economy than a post-oil economy. We are seeing the transition, but that transition is going to be gradual. And we're talking mainly about after 40, 50 years down the line. I don't like to make forecasts beyond 10 years because no one knows how fast the technology is going to change. But I think for the time being, they have to coexist because we don't have many other choices.
What we see in the Middle East in some countries that they are actually now making big commitments to switch to renewables. Is that just rhetoric or is there substance behind those commitments?
They are making big commitments, but when you travel around in the Middle East, you don't really see much of renewable energy, mainly if you think about solar power, for instance, because this is where you have plenty of sun. But it's not because of lack of commitment, but because of the reality. You're talking about desert there. So the heat is affecting the solar panels, and the sand is also affecting the performance of the solar panels. Some countries like the UAE went down the route of having nuclear power plant, but that comes with a massive price tag, and this cannot be easily replicated in other countries in the region. So we are seeing that commitment, but let's face it, I don't see this happening in the near future.
But can the money that they make on oil, can that fund the post-oil transition?
It is funding it. This nuclear power plant in the UAE did not come from other money than the oil money. And elsewhere, if you look globally, so if you move away from the Middle East and look globally, if you look at the taxes paid by international oil companies and by consumers and how much they generate revenues to governments, these revenues are being used to fund renewable energy because renewable energy is heavily subsidized, so they need the government backing.
Carole, thank you very much for joining Raw Talks.
Thank you for having me with you.
And to keep up with the new debate on extractives and development, join us at rawtalks.org.